Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah. So autumn has well and truly hit in Scotland at the moment. It's freezing cold and I thought it would be nice to film a Halloween book recommendations video. So I don't read an awful lot of horror. I tend to read what I like to call vibes are off books, which are, I think, scary in their own right. So the kind of books where there's something unnerving and unsettling sort of running through them, and you struggle to put your finger on just what it is that's not quite right, but you know that there's something. And yeah, just books that make you feel really on edge. That's just my perfect kind of book, and this is the perfect time of year to read that kind of book. So I've split my recommendations into 5 categories. Hopefully there will be something for everyone. There's a mix of kind of fantasy and literary fiction and classics, and yeah, let's just get on with the video. So the first category that I like to call kind of atmospheric, gothic, creepy kind of books, and I have 2 books to talk to you about that could make up a category in their own right because they're both by the author Sergey Cooke, who I think is the perfect example of a writer who is really great at writing atmosphere and spooky stories that aren't necessarily horror, and just supernatural goings on that you can't quite put your finger on, and you're not sure exactly how much is fantasy and how much is rooted in reality. I have a very hit and miss relationship with Sergey Cooke, which I've mentioned before. I really didn't like her book The Nesting, which was the first one I read. I thought the plot was a mess, but I really liked her style of writing and how she created atmosphere, so I carried on reading more books by her and ended up really enjoying the 2 that I'm going to talk to you about. I also have vlogs of both of these books linked down in the comments, so if you want to hear me chat about both of them in a bit more depth, then I will leave those for you down below. So the first one, which I think is my favourite Sergey Cooke, is The Lighthouse Witches, and this is a mixture of contemporary historical and is fantasy horror adjacent, I would say. I think that's a really good way of describing Sergey Cooke in general, like fantasy horror adjacent. You're not sure how much is actually the supernatural or the fantastical and how much is rooted in the trauma of the characters. Sergey Cooke focuses a lot on female trauma in particular. So at the start of the book we're following a character called Luna in the present day, and Luna is in her late 20s, expecting her first child with her partner, and the relationship sort of isn't that great. They're living in England and they're not really sure if they're going to continue living together and raising the child sort of as a family unit under the same roof, basically. And Luna gets a phone call from the hospital in Inverness telling her they have found her sister, who has been missing for several decades at this point. We know that Luna is the only presumed surviving member of her family. Her mother and 2 of her sisters went missing when the family relocated to a remote Scottish island in the 90s, and the circumstances surrounding their disappearance are very mysterious, and we're not really sure exactly how it happened, but we know that it happened. So Luna's thinking, great, you found my sister, I'll be up there as soon as I can. She drives up to Inverness from England, and when she gets there expecting to see a woman in her 20s, she is confronted by her sister, but as the sort of 7-year-old she was when she went missing. So she hasn't aged at all, and she has a strange mark branded on her. And obviously that's very creepy, but she takes the child anyway. She gives them a false date of birth for her sister to make her appear to be the age that she is, and doesn't kind of let on that this girl disappeared many years ago and should be in her late 20s by now. So she takes the child sort of to live with her, and while they're staying in guest houses from the long drive from Inverness back to England, the child is just very strange, saying some strange things, doing some strange things, and just completely wrecking the places that they live in. It's almost like living with a wild animal rather than a child, in terms of like the destruction that this child is wreaking on the house. And from there we kind of flash back to what happened on this remote Scottish island in the 90s, where Luna and her family went with their mother, who was an artist commissioned to paint a mural in a very creepy old lighthouse. And the people on the island are very strange and insular, and are convinced that there are changelings on this island as well. So I don't want to really give too much away apart from that. If you like that kind of premise, then you're probably going to really like this. I thought it was, like I said, my favourite CJ Cooke that I've read so far. Very atmospheric, creepy. You did have to suspend your disbelief a little bit. I think you just kind of have to do that with CJ Cooke, just the kind of writer that she is. But I think that's what makes it a bit unsettling. I felt, rather than having to suspend my disbelief and thinking this is unrealistic, when the child is sort of just given to Luna, sort of no questions asked, I found that, yeah, rather than unrealistic, I found it quite disturbing, and you know something's not quite right because that wouldn't actually happen. It makes it more kind of like a dream, I suppose, like a just unsettling dream that you can't sort of anchor in reality. I don't know, but yeah, I just really enjoyed that one. And the other one I've read by CJ Cooke is The Ghostwoods, which is a historical fiction following two narratives. So we follow at first a character called Mabel in 1959, and then we flash forward a little bit to Pearl in 1965, and eventually these two narratives come together as the novel progresses. So both of these women are pregnant unwed mothers, which at the time in Scotland and just the UK in general, it's set in the Scottish borders, I don't know if I said that, it was just scandalous, and they couldn't sort of raise the child by themselves like they can now, because they're kind of outcasted from society. Like both of them lose their jobs as a result of being unwed mothers, so they're sent to Lighthouse, which is this crumbling, dilapidated building in the Scottish borders, run by the formidable Mrs. Whitlock, who is a terrifying character. And the difference between these two girls is that Mabel is quite a bit younger than Pearl, so she's 17 and Pearl is in her early 20s. Mabel's convinced that she can't be pregnant because she's never had sex. She has a boyfriend and they've never slept together, so obviously he's not the father. And she's like, well, who is the father? I've never had sex with anybody. And nobody believes her and thinks that they all think that she's lying because she's disgraced, essentially. So we follow her, and we follow Pearl, who is in her early 20s, and she does know the father of her child, but she doesn't have any kind of relationship with him. He's kind of a one-night stand while she was getting over her heartbreak from her relationship with her long-term partner Sebastian ending. So you have sort of their backgrounds, and we're basically following both of them on the same journey but at different points in time. So like I said, Mabel arrives in the late 1950s and Pearl arrives in the mid 1960s. And this Lighthouse is very Gothic in its setting. So it's this, you know, grand manor house that has been left to ruin. It's dilapidated, it's gross, and they've been told that they're not allowed to enter a certain part of the building because there is a lot of fungus, which could be a risk to the health of the mother and the child as well. So we've got that real earthy Gothic setting. It's a house in the middle of nowhere, and I think one of the things that makes CJ Cooke's story so kind of scary for me is not necessarily what's happening within them, but rather that sense of isolation. So in the Lighthouse Witches, they're on this remote Scottish island that is really hard to get on and off of. And in the Ghost Woods, they're in this rural manor house surrounded by lots of forest, and there's sort of no means of them escaping. And the Ghost Woods, like I said, Mrs. Whitlock is a very formidable character. She at first appears to be quite friendly, but we quite soon realise that she's very controlling and abusive, emotionally and physically, towards the girls who come there. And it's just not a very nice place to be an expectant mother. She is very cagey and doesn't like any interference from the outside world, so she refuses to have doctors and midwives present at all, and just sort of lets the girls sort of get on with the births without any medical intervention. So I think that in itself is kind of scary enough, but on top of that we have this mysterious Ghost Woods as the backdrop of the whole novel, where kind of ghostly sightings have been spotted, and you know, everyone's terrified of these woods because they've seen awful things in them. And Pearl also sees a child running around Lichen Hall, but when she confronts Mrs. Whitlock and sort of the housekeepers there, they are again very cagey and just like, no, that's not possible, and sort of refuse to speak to her about it anymore. So there's that real sense of mystery and creepiness, like who is this child and why is he running around, and he's not supposed to, and yeah, just really creepy, gothic, atmospheric, the kind of book that I just devour, and it's one that I would highly recommend for this time of year. So if you like that real earthy, gothic, mushroomy kind of vibe, I have to recommend Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is a very divisive book, I think. I think lots of people really like it and other people really don't like it. I think it all comes down to the kind of reader that you are. So I really like books that don't have a huge amount of plot, that build up atmosphere and do a sense of place really well, and this book is that for me. I thought the pacing was really good. It's very slow and it sort of builds to a crescendo sort of in the last 50 pages or so, and yeah, definitely like a lot of the books I recommend, no plot, just vibes until the very end where there is a plot. But this is following this, again, historical fiction set in the 1950s, and we're following a character called Naomi, who is a young socialite living in Mexico City. So her life is just all, you know, parties and just really enjoying life and not really having any care. She's very wealthy and privileged and just has this fantastic life, and she is asked to go and stay with her cousin, who lives out in the countryside in an old colonial house where she's married into a white British family. And the cousin, they think, is having some kind of mental episode where she's saying that she's in danger, and they don't necessarily believe that this is true. They think she's unwell, and so they send Naomi to go and see her and just to check she's okay and, you know, see if there's anything she can do to help. So she goes there, kind of annoyed really that she has to leave her life in Mexico City to go and stay out in the countryside, and she's thinking, you know, it's gonna be really boring. Gets to this old house that's been kind of left to ruin. Like I said, the family are white British that the cousin has married into, and it's all just very sinister. As soon as Naomi gets there, pretty much she starts having these strange dreams that seem very realistic, in which horrible things are happening. And again, there's a lot of mushroom imagery, and yeah, it's just a perfect example of what I want from a piece of Gothic fiction. I think it deals really well with themes of empire, colonialism, of eugenics, of racism, of sexism, and I think what adds to the real horror of this book is kind of that colonial aspect of it and the racism, That's where the real horror comes from, even though it is quite a scary book anyway, in terms of you think maybe something supernatural is afoot, but that for me is sort of at the heart of the horror, and I think that was really, really well done. And yeah, again, just the perfect book for Halloween if you like kind of scary books that aren't horror. So the next two books I have are again quite similar, both to each other and also to well, both the CJ Cooke books and Mexican Gothic, but in particular CJ Cooke because they're both set in Scotland. The first book is Pine by Francine Toon, and this is a contemporary following a young girl called Lauren who is 10, living in a remote village in the Scottish Highlands. Again, that very rural, cut off from the rest of society kind of setting. And she lives with her father, who is dealing with alcohol addiction following the disappearance of Lauren's mother several years earlier, and no one really knows what has happened to her. She just seems to vanish one day and is really kind of presumed dead, I think, by most of the people in the village. So Lauren's father is taking her to the house of another child on Halloween to go trick-or-treating, and as they're driving, a woman runs out in front of the car and just kind of stares at them and looks alarmed and scared, and then just disappears again. And Lauren's obviously like, okay, what was that all about? Asks her dad about it, and her dad's just like, what woman? What are you talking about? That didn't happen. And we're just unraveling the mystery of what happened to Lauren's mother from there, and it's again atmospheric, eerie, chilling, genuinely scary at points, even though it's again very much driven by atmosphere and not by plot. And yeah, I love this one, but again, I think it's one of those that some people really like and some people really don't. If you have similar reading tastes to me, like you don't like necessarily too much plot, you will like it. If you like to have plot in your books, you won't like it. But I think you could probably say that about most of the books on this list. If you like very plotty books that are fast paced and full of action, you're probably on the wrong channel, just because that's not the kind of thing that I like to read usually. Sometimes, but not usually. And the second book is very similar to that, called Hare House by Sally Hinchcliffe, where we are following a woman who is never named. We have very little information to go on. We only know kind of an approximate age for her. All we know is that she left London, where she used to be a teacher, and it's just heavily implied that she is disgraced for whatever reason, and we're not really sure what went down in the school, but she is no longer able to teach, and she now works as a tutor sort of remotely. Goes to a cottage called Hare House in Scotland, again very cut off from the nearest village. She has to get a bus into the nearest town, and the buses don't run very frequently. She doesn't drive, and so there's that real sense of isolation from the start, which is quite unnerving. She befriends the man who owns the house. He's called Grant, and he lives there with his sister, who is 17 and is a bit strange. Their brother died in a car accident. It's something that as a family they don't like to talk about. And then to add to the mystery and intrigue, we have a very nosy neighbour who I think is called Janet, and Grant's sister implies that she is a witch, and you know, at first it's kind of laughed off and just been like, oh, she's just nosy and a bit strange. She's definitely not a witch. But as the novel progresses, we start to see more and more things sort of tainted by the supernatural, and we start to think, oh, hang on, is there some sort of truth in this? And again, it's not necessarily what's going on in terms of you know, could this be supernatural? The fear comes from being very isolated. A lot of the story, although it starts in sort of the autumn, a lot of it is set during a period of very heavy snowfall, where these people are all living together and obviously don't have a lot of breathing space because they're sort of all confined within this quite small space that's very cut off from everyone. And we build to a real like crescendo of emotion, and that is where, to me, the fear came from, was the relationship between these people kind of falling apart, I suppose. So yeah, another no plot, just vibes that I really enjoyed, which kind of segues in quite nicely to my next category, and this is what I like to call no plot, just terrible vibes, which I guess the first category could be considered that too, but these books are all more literary, I would say. So the first book I have on here is Vita Nostra, and that's by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko, and translated from Russian by Julia Maitap-Hersey. This is a dark academia fantasy book that was pitched to me on Goodreads as Franz Kafka meets Harry Potter, and that sounded good, but it wasn't that. I can see where the Kafka elements come from. The Harry Potter elements, I mean, it's similar to Harry Potter in that it's primarily set in a magical school, but that's like as far as the similarities go. It's nothing like Harry Potter, and I think if you go in expecting that kind of vibe, you're going to be disappointed. So this follows a character called Sasha, who is about 17, and she meets a very strange man on her summer holiday, and he makes her swim out into the sea every day to touch like a boy in the sea, not like a man boy, like a boy in the sea, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, she has to swim out and touch it and come back, and he gives her a gold coin, and he tells her, if you don't do it, something horrible is going to happen. And when she doesn't do it, something horrible does indeed happen. So she continues doing this thing every day and builds up this collection of coins. Her holiday ends and she thinks, okay, that was very strange, but at least that's never going to happen again. Until he comes back in her hometown and starts making her do strange things again in exchange for coins. And eventually this man, Farret, I think his name is, he tells her that she's been accepted to this school of special technologies and she can use her gold coins to gain entrance to this school. And so she goes, and Mother's just like, no, what are you doing? I've never heard of that school before. Sounds terrible. You've got this other university that you could go to that's so much better than that. But Sasha is, well, she's drawn to this school, but there's also that sense of like, she can't really say no. She has no choice in it. She is going to end up at this school. And so off she goes to the school of special technologies, and yeah, it's a ride once you get to the school. The kind of lessons they're taught make absolutely no sense, and I just think it's so well conveyed within the book. It's hard for me to explain it, but she's being taught this utter gibberish and being punished for not understanding it, and it's really hard to get your head around how you could convey that in the text, but the authors do such a good job of that. It's very scary in the sense of the punishments that are doled out. So if the pupils don't do their work or they don't learn at the expected speed, they're not punished, but awful things happen to their families, and that's how this school keeps them in line. Genuinely one of the scariest books I've ever read, simultaneously one of the most frustrating books I've ever read. I was completely captivated. I felt completely stupid at the end when I had no idea what was going on. I just absolutely loved this, and I can't wait to reread it. I think I'm going to give it a reread this season, because the next book in sort of Sasha's universe has just been released, or it was released a couple of months ago, and I really want to read that, but I think I'd like to read Vita Nostra before I do that. Then we have Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk, and this is translated from the Polish by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. This is marketed as an eco-thriller, and I would agree with that. It's not a thriller in the sense that, you know, like a commercial thriller. It's definitely not that. It's much more of a literary thriller. We're following a character called Janina, who is an elderly woman living in a remote Polish town. This town is very popular in the summer months with tourists, but as the winter draws in, tourists go back to, you know, their lives up in the city, and we're left with a very small community of people who actually live there full time. And Janina one day finds one of her community dead in his house, and wants to get to the bottom of what happened. He's like obviously been murdered, and she is, yeah, just trying to piece together what's happened, because he turns out to not be the only man who dies in very brutal circumstances, and she is convinced that it is the animals of the forest who are killing them as revenge for them hunting them, basically. So yeah, it's a thriller where she is trying to piece together what has happened, and also is very much ridiculed by the police. She's really trying to help with their investigation, and they're just like, oh no, you're just like a senile old woman, basically, and she's dismissed. And I think it speaks a lot to sort of how women are treated by society as they age. Like the treatment of women sort of in a way gets even worse as they age, and she's just, you know, very much dismissed as somebody who doesn't have sort of valid and worthwhile opinions and knowledge. And yeah, I just thought it was really well done. I thought the ending was very good, and I still think about this a lot, even though I read it several years ago. Then we have The Employees by Olga Ravn. This is again a translated work. This is translated from the Danish by Martin Aitken, and I almost don't want to say too much about this because it's very much one that you read for the experience. So we're following a spaceship. It's kind of sci-fi adjacent. I've used that word adjacent a lot. I don't like reading sci-fi. This isn't really sci-fi. It's not a lot to get your head around. It's just we're following these characters who are on a spaceship sort of set in the future, and that's about as sci-fi as we get. Half of this cast of characters are humanoids and half are actual humans, so we just get kind of very brief logs from a lot of different people. We don't spend more than a couple of pages with each character. Some just have a word or a line, and yeah, like I said, some are humans, some are humanoids, and at the start it's quite obvious which ones are the humans and which ones are the humanoids, but as we progress those lines start to become a lot more blurred, and yeah, it's really just saying a lot about what it means to be human, and is a critique of late stage capitalism mostly, which is a terrifying thing. Late stage capitalism is terrifying, so that alone is enough for it to go on this list. We have Boy Parts by Eliza Clarke, which is one of my favourite books that I've read so far this year. I really loved it. We are following a character called Irina, who is in her 20s and kind of stuck in this, like, not really a dead-end job. She works in a bar, but doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life, and she's involved in an altercation while she's at work and placed on sort of like paid leave essentially, and so she uses this time where she has a wage coming in from a job and not having to actually go to this job to pursue her actual passion in life, which is photography. So Irina's work is really pushing the boundaries of what is ethical and what isn't. She takes photographs of men in very compromising positions, so sort of being mostly sexually dominated, but also just like emotionally and physically dominated as well. So she sort of scouts these men who she thinks she'll be able to take advantage of, and she's really just being physically and emotionally abusive to these men and taking their pictures, and they're getting attached to her. She's a very beautiful woman, and these men are just doing basically like whatever she says, and she's really capturing them at their most vulnerable, and selling their pictures to make money. So it really is talking a lot about gender and sexuality and power dynamics. I think Irina, well, she is a very unlikable narcissistic character, but you do kind of root for her, I think, because you can see that a lot of her actions are just very much a cry for help, even though she has this very distant facade on, and she just seems like she's completely got everything together, and she just has, you know, no emotions whatsoever, and she's, you know, a very powerful and success-driven woman who just doesn't have time for all these men, and she's just presented as very cold, but I just very much viewed it as her life just completely spiraling. And it's just really good book, quite graphic in places in terms of like body horror, not necessarily gory horror, but just like just speaking in a not particularly nice way about bodily functions and some bodily injuries as well, I suppose. So just that to be aware of. So the next category I have is weird / what the fuck did I just read, and I have 3 books on this list. The first being Bunny by Mona Awad, which I think is the weirdest book I've ever read, and in this book we're following a character called Samantha, who has been accepted onto a postgraduate creative writing program at Warren University, and she doesn't really have any friends. She's a bit of a loner, and she despises the girls that she is studying with. So it's a very tiny cohort of students because it's a very prestigious creative writing program. So the girls that she's on this program with, she calls the bunnies, and they're just presented as very saccharine, sweet, kind of bland characters without much personality. So they're just, you know, these very beautiful girls who love to wear pastel colours, and they love, you know, like very twee, they have very twee interests, and they like sort of baked goods and just very saccharine. There's something about them, but there's also a more sinister level to them, and they invite Samantha into their circle, and things just get very weird from there. That's all I can say. If you like sort of very psychedelic novels and novels where you're not really sure what on earth is going on, you'll like this. But again, lots of body horror within it, so be warned. Then I have Little Eyes by Samanta Schweblin, and this is translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. This is a very Black Mirror-esque story which follows a lot of different perspectives. So again, we don't stay with the same character for very long. It's more like a series of short stories, I suppose, but they're all sort of linked by this overarching plot line, which is that there are these new gadgets called Kentuckis, and they are like very small, cute looking animals, like little tiny robots, I suppose, and you can use them to either spy into somebody else's life. So they'll have the Kentucky in their home and you can just watch them sort of living their life, or you can have a Kentucky with a camera in your own home and somebody you don't know will just be watching sort of your every move in your house. Very weird, and as you can imagine, things are very sinister. Some stories are just quite mundane and slides of life, so somebody just watching somebody else living their life, or somebody just having somebody else watching them and kind of performing a role for that person. And then others, as you can imagine, are a lot more sinister. And yeah, it's just a really great novel that isn't necessarily scary, but it does kind of put you on edge, and you can kind of see it happening. You just think, why would you ever want somebody spying on you? But you could also see that this particular technology could just so easily take off and sort of take over our lives. So yeah, really well done and highly recommend it. And the last one in this category is probably the most traditionally scary of all the books on this list, and that's I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. So in this, we're following a couple as they set out on a road trip in the middle of winter to, again, a very rural setting to visit his parents. And when they get there, the parents are just very strange, and it's a very sinister vibe. It's a lot like Get Out in terms of the vibe of going to stay with these parents who are very odd and don't seem real at all, and we just sort of get the vibe that there's a sinister motive afoot. But the real scariness then comes from when they leave the parents' house and are driving back home in the middle of the night. They end up at this abandoned building, and honestly, like, I've never been so scared in my life. It was terrifying. The ending is a complete mindfuck. It just hits you out of nowhere. I originally gave this book 3 stars because the ending was just so weird and so unexpected. I was just like, what the hell did I just read? I hated it. But I've thought about this book pretty much every day since I've read it, and I read it years ago. It's stuck with me, and yeah, I genuinely now think it's one of the best endings of a book that I've ever read. And yeah, if you want like actual scary, this is the closest I'm going to recommend you to a traditionally scary horror book. Then I have a category that just has one book in it, and it's called The Most Horrifying Thing You'll Ever Read, and this is Tender as the Flesh by Augustine Baztericca, translated from the Spanish by Sophie Hughes. This is a book which follows a man called Marcus who works at a meat processing plant, except this plant doesn't process cows, pigs, sheep, things that you would expect. It processes human beings. So we live in this book in a world where animals have all been infected with some kind of disease, which means it's not safe for humans to consume their meat, and so human beings have turned to eating other human beings, and it's horrific. The descriptions at this processing plant and slaughterhouse are some of the most stomach churning things you'll ever read. So the premise of the story is that Marcus is gifted a head by his boss at work, and it's basically a woman who her purpose is to be fattened up and then eaten. She's sort of regarded as like prime cuts of meat, essentially, like the best meat that you can get. And at first Marcus is just kind of horrified by the idea of this, and it's just like, I'm not sure I want to do that. So he just keeps her in the shed tied up, and then kind of develops feelings for her as a human being, and then generally sort of more messed up feelings towards her. And the end of part 1 of this book made me feel physically sick. It was absolutely disgusting. That's all I'm going to really tell you about the plot. The reason I liked this so much, despite how graphic and horrifying it is because I think it raises some really good questions about not just the meat industry as it is now, because everything that happens in this book to human beings is already happening to like cows and pigs and sheep and chickens, and I think it's a really effective way of highlighting the cruelty of the meat, egg and dairy industry. So there's that. But I think it also raises a lot of questions about how we select those humans. So how do we get to a point where some human beings are being eaten and some are doing the eating? And it's really effective in that it doesn't give you any answers to those questions, and you're just kind of left to figure it out. We wonder whether there is actually a disease, or whether this is just some government conspiracy to, you know, reduce overpopulation. We wonder why, as a society, people don't just go vegan rather than resorting to eating other human beings. But I think personally that it is more realistic, unfortunately, to imagine humans eating other humans than to imagine all humans adopting a vegan lifestyle. And yeah, just so good in the questions it raises. I think as a book it raises more questions than it answers, but I think that's what makes it so effective to me. It's not telling you what to think, it's just making you question, you know, your own thoughts towards the meat industry and letting you reach sort of your own conclusions, and, you know, making you ask those questions that you probably haven't really thought of before. So that is definitely one to read if you can stomach very graphic body horror. If you're looking for a book that tackles kind of similar themes but does it in a less explicitly gross way, I'd recommend Of Cattle and Men by Paula Maia, and that's translated from Portuguese by Zoe Perry. Quite similar, not quite the same, but definitely less gross than Tender as the Flesh. So the last category I have here is classics and classic retellings. I don't read a lot of classics. It's just not a genre that I'm particularly interested in or drawn to, but I do have one classic on here that I would really recommend. I guess two. I mean, the first one that I'm gonna mention is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I'm not gonna sort of tell you what that's about or recommend it to you, because you don't need me to recommend Frankenstein at Halloween, like it's the obvious choice. But I am going to recommend two retellings based on that. So the first one of those retellings is Poor Things by Alistair Gray, which I guess is a classic in its own right. It's definitely a modern Scottish classic, and we're following a character called Godwin Baxter who brings a woman back from the dead by changing her brain and replacing it with an infant's brain, and we get the character of Bella Baxter. So most of the story is told by a character called Dr. McCandless, and a lot of Bella's story we see through the lens of him, and he is absolutely infatuated by her. It's a great satirization of the Victorian novel, I would say. It's definitely a political allegory, and it talks a lot about the roles of men and women, the treatment of women, how women are perceived by men, and it also says a lot about social class as well. And yeah, it's just really, really brilliant. And then the other Frankenstein, I guess retelling, it's a loose retelling. It sort of takes themes from Frankenstein and transplants it into a more contemporary context. That is Frankenstein in Baghdad, and that is written by Ahmed Saadawi and translated from Arabic by Jonathan Wright. So this is set in Baghdad in, I think, about 2005, so at the height of the American occupation of Iraq, and we're following a character called Hare for the most part, who is it's like a scrap merchant essentially. And what Hare does is he collects body parts from people who have been killed in this sort of awful conflict, stitches them all together to create his own kind of Frankenstein's monster. That monster kind of takes on a life of its own, and in order to survive it needs to keep reclaiming victims and, you know, taking parts of their bodies to sort of nourish itself. It does a really good job of looking at war and to what extent people are victims. So this monster primarily goes after people who it deems have done something so wrong that they deserve to have their life taken, and he goes after, you know, sort of very, morally grey is not the right word, but people who've committed atrocities and who are in some way responsible for the deaths of the people that this corpse is made up of. It sort of raises that question where it's like, is it right to take a life for a life? You know, it's so well done. Great dark humour. We do get a lot of different perspectives. Like I said, we're primarily following Hare, but we also hear from, you know, other people who have been affected by the occupation as well. And yeah, it's just so good. I really, really enjoyed it. I think if you're going to read one book from this list, that will be the one that I recommend you read. I've been talking for so long that my candle has burned out and fallen back into the gin bottle. So I'm going to wrap this up now. I just have one more book to talk to you about, which is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, a classic where we have a young man called Dorian who makes a Faustian pact to stay beautiful forever. But his portrait, who's painted by his friend Basil Hallward, and stays up in an attic, sort of hidden away from everybody, that ages with all the sins that he has committed. So while Dorian himself is very beautiful, you have this very disturbing portrait. So while Dorian himself stays very beautiful, this portrait up in his attic is aging horrifically and at a much faster pace than Dorian himself would have aged naturally, because of the sins that Dorian is committing. It's a really good exploration of sexuality and of class, and yeah, it's just such an accessible, easy, fun, a little bit scary kind of read. That's one of my favourite books of all time, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And the book I'm going to recommend off the back of that is Every Exquisite Thing by Laura Stephen, which is one that I've only just finished reading. And this is a YA, dark academia, sapphic retelling of The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I was a bit unsure going into it because it's a YA and I don't read a lot of YA, and I think particularly because there's a romance element, I was just like, oh, this is probably going to be quite cringe, I'm not going to like it. But honestly, it's probably the best YA book that I've ever read. We're following a character called Penny, who is the daughter of an icon called Peggy Paxton, who is a very famous actress and very beloved within UK society, and she goes to a school called Dorian, which is an acting school, a very prestigious acting school, and she's like wanting to follow in the footsteps of her mother but also gain her mother's love. So her mother was a very distant, cold woman who suffered from bouts of addiction and depression, and so Penny spent most of her life without that parental love, and she thinks that by going to Dorian and securing the lead role in their production of Macbeth, she will get that love that she craves so much from her mum. What actually happens is that Penny is overlooked for the role by a character called Davina. Davina gets the role as Lady Macbeth, and Penny's world kind of comes crashing down. Davina quickly becomes her enemy, and Penny ends up blackmailing Davina to get her part in Macbeth that she thinks is rightfully hers. She thinks she deserves it more than Davina does. And Penny ends up being mentored by a very famous actress called Olga, who is known for her striking youthful beauty. Even though she must be sort of well into her 60s, 70s, she still looks like a 30-year-old woman. And she introduces Penny to the gallery of the exquisite, which is where you can have your portrait painted, and your portrait will age for you while you remain sort of eternally beautiful and youthful. And as Penny is dealing with an eating disorder and alopecia, she thinks, great, I will do that because then I'll never have to worry about being beautiful again, and I can just then focus on my art. And if I'm always beautiful, I will find it easier to have love in my life. But obviously things don't go to plan, and it is obviously a terrible idea to make a Faustian pact for eternal beauty, and that is explored really well within the book. Yeah, very creepy, gothic, scary, quite gross. Some of the parts make me feel really squeamish, and just a really good exploration of toxic beauty standards. I don't think it necessarily is saying a lot that is new that people haven't already spoken about before, but I think in this context of it being a YA novel, it's done really, really well, and it's definitely the kind of book that I wish that I'd had when I was like 16 or 17, because I think a lot of young girls in particular will really get something from this book, and it's just a fun romp as well. So there's that. But yeah, this is the most plotty book, I would say, of all of them that I've suggested to you, and it's just a lot of fun despite dealing with some really serious themes as well. So that, finally, after more than an hour of filming, is the end of my video of Halloween recommendations. I'd love to know if you've read any of these, what you thought of them, or if you have any recommendations of your own to share, leave them down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again soon in a hopefully much shorter video. Bye.